Greetings and salutations. Welcome to a video about audio. Today I am going to tell you how to set up your Stanton and Pickering Phono cartridges with a brush. There is a lot of opinion and misinformation on the internet about this, and I'm hoping this video will cut through all of that and give you some pretty easy to understand basic procedures that you can follow to set up these cartridges and get good audio quality from them. These classic cartridges are a lot of fun to play with, and when set up properly, there is nothing today that sounds as good as they do available on the market. I've looked, I know. So we're going to get into the how-to section right up front for those who want to learn how to get started and want to go play some records. If you bail out on the video early, just be sure and come back later because I'm going to share some of my opinions. We'll talk about what the brush actually does. It's not just there to clean records. There are actually some benefits to your audio from it being there, and I will also go into detail about how I came up with these methods and why I believe, as of now, that this is the best way to go. So let's get started. There are two methods for setting up these cartridges with brushes. Method one is certainly the quickest, and it's the easiest. It is probably the least accurate, and you have to make sure that your turntable is level before you do this, and we are assuming that your tone arm is a well-designed one that balances properly. For most people out there, this should work perfectly fine. It's no problem whatsoever. Just make sure that your turntable is level before you start. The first thing that you'll need to do is determine what tracking force you need to run, and that's going to depend on the stylus on your cartridge. If it is an original Pickering or Stanton stylus, it should have some numbers on it. You should be able to go look those numbers up online, and then you can get information about the tracking force. It'll tell you exactly what that cartridge is supposed to track at with that stylus. Generally, the Stanton cartridges that came with the brushes track somewhere between 1 and 5 grams. Yeah, I know, that's a super wide range, isn't it? If it's a higher end Stanton stylus, they usually want it to track at about 1¼ grams. If it is a more rugged or earlier Stanton stylus, then they would simply say that this stylus tracks between 2 and 5 grams. A lot of the quote-unquote DJ styli that Stanton put out through the years did not come with the brush because they knew that the end user was going to be back queuing records, and so they didn't bother to include it. However, if you have, let's say, a D6800E stylus, you can add the brush to it. Pickering cartridges never came with those super high tracking force type styli, and so if you have a brush on it, it should track somewhere between 1 and 3 grams. So how do you determine the tracking force if you can't find the documentation? Well, that's pretty easy. You will start out at the low end, which is usually about 1 gram, and then you will start adding and listening. So set your system up to track, let's say, at 1.5 grams. That would be the lowest that I would say. Really, you could get away with tracking accurately. I know that they advertised 1.25 grams, but that's a bit low. So you can do 1.5 grams. And listen to a record that has a lot of high frequency information on it. A lot of S's, a lot of symbols. And if you hear sibilance distortion, in other words, hard S's, splatters, when people say the letter S or sing it, then you probably are tracking too lightly and you need to add more. And you just keep doing that about 1/4 gram at a time until you get to a point where you no longer hear any distortion. That's how you know you have your tracking force dialed in properly. It is better to track higher than lower than the tracking force needed. So if you are going to be doing the listening method, don't worry about being over, worry about being under. Now, if you get to the point where you're tracking at like 5.5 grams and it still sounds bad, there's something wrong with that stylus. Either it's a crappy aftermarket stylus that doesn't sound good anyway and should be replaced, or it is a worn-out stylus which you do not want to play your records with at all. In that case, you're going to go stylus hunting for a new one. Good luck. We'll talk more about that at the end of the video. So once you have figured out your tracking force, in this example we're doing 2 grams, you need to balance your tone arm for 0 grams, which means that basically you want to make it like a seesaw with equal weight on either side to where it floats horizontally. 0 is the point at which the arm will just float above the surface of a record without the stylus itself touching the surface of the record. Now we are talking about 1 or 2 millimeters of distance between the surface of the record and the stylus, not a quarter of an inch. If you have that, then that is not 0. Your cartridge is probably weighted too much in the back there, and that's not a good starting point. With the brush on, the tip of the brush should just about touch the record, and the stylus should still be up in the air. That's how you know where 0 is with one of these cartridges. It goes without saying that you want to make sure that you do your alignment first. The cartridge needs to be in the position where you're going to actually play it. So don't go setting your tracking force and then get out your alignment protractor. No, you do it the other way around. Turn off anti-skating before you do any of this stuff, and then just put enough downforce on the cartridge to where you can put it on your your protractor there to see whether you have it properly aligned. So once you find out where 0 is, then what you will do is set the indicator dial on the counterweight to 0. There should be a little line or a groove carved into the place where the counterweight screws back and forth on the tone arm. Line 0 up with that, and then you know that you're starting out with a perfectly balanced arm. Now take the entire counterweight and turn it until that indicator points at 3 grams. And with your anti-skate, set that to 3 as well. And if you have a fishing line and weight type anti-skate, there should be a little place where you can take the fishing line, a little detent on where that hooks to the back of the arm that you can put. That should be in the 3 gram range. That's where you need to be. Now, the reason why we are setting everything to 3 instead of 2 is because we need to add a gram to compensate for the brush. The brush is simply weighs 1 gram. And so when you put the needle down on the record with the brush itself rides the surface of the records and it negates its own weight. So we need to make sure that we're including that when we set up our tracking force. If you were attempting to get a cartridge to track at 1 gram, for instance, and you did not compensate for the brush, it wouldn't track the record at all. It would just skate right across, and that would be the end of it. We'll get more into anti-skate and setting that and why you set it to a full gram a little bit later on. So that is method 1. That should work with most turntables with well-designed tone arms, and happy listening. Method 2, this is setting it up without the brush, and then we install it later. And this is what we would do if we had a very high-end stylus. Let's say that you bought yourself one of those Geico Vivid Line styli that costs north of $200 for your Stanton 681, and you want to set it up properly. So the first thing that you would do is remove the stylus from the cartridge, and then you would remove the brush from the stylus. And if you get a little magnifying glass and look, it should be pretty obvious how that is hooked up. They're pretty easy to do. It's a lot easier to remove the stylus brush from a Pickering cartridge than it is a Stanton, but you can do it. Just be careful, don't break the stylus, especially if it's one of those very expensive ones. Once again, we will balance the tone arm following the same procedure. No anti-skate. You want to make sure that the cartridge is aligned properly first and it's not going to move in the head shell. And you just hold the cartridge in your hand and hold the counterweight in the other, turning it carefully until it just floats above the surface of a record. That's your 0 point. Now, on the indicator on the counterweight, set that to 0, and now we dial up the desired tracking force exactly. We're not adding anything because there's no brush on the cartridge. So if you want 2 grams, then you dial it up to 2 grams. Now, you can bust out your little scale, and you can fine-tune it if you want to, if you have a vertical tracking force gauge or one of those little electronic scales. You can get it exactly where you want it to be. Go ahead and lock the tone arm down in the rest, Take the stylus back off again very carefully, put the brush back on, slide it back in, and now set your anti-skate to 3 like we did before, and you are ready to play, and you know exactly what your vertical tracking force is at the stylus tip. That is what you have set, and the brush takes care of itself. For anti-skate, we still have to add 1 gram to compensate for the brush's action on the record. We'll talk more about that a little bit later on. So you should be set up and ready to play, so if you want to go off and play records now, be my guest, but come back for more information about what this brush does and why there has been so much controversy over these brushes for about the past 60 years. The reason why there is so much misinformation and opinion about the brushes on Stanton and Pickering cartridges is because the company themselves, and by the way, Stanton and Pickering are the same company. Pickering cartridges were marketed to home hi-fi enthusiasts, while Stanton cartridges were usually touted as being industry standard for professionals. And they are very different in their designs, but they do share the use of the brush. This is the kind of instructions that you got. This one came from a manual for a Pickering XV15 DCF series cartridge that I had a couple of years ago. Well, it's been more than a couple of years ago now, but you know how time goes when you get old. And I went ahead and scanned the manual in. This is all they tell you to do. They say balance the tone arm and mounted cartridge according to turntable manufacturer's instructions. At balance, brush and stylus tip should just clear the record. Apply the desired tracking force plus 1 gram to compensate for the weight of the brush. Now it's ready for play, blah, 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 as we go down through here. They don't say anything about anti-skate at all. Nothing. They don't explain it. And so therefore, they created a vacuum. And people can't stand a vacuum, so they fill it with their own ideas and opinions. There are some audiophiles out there that think the brush is just the devil and you should never run one on a cartridge, and they're horrible and they're awful. I posted a video about my Fluence RT85 turntable shortly after I got it, and at that point in time I had a Stanton cartridge with a aftermarket Pickering compatible stylus on it that had a brush, and I mentioned it in the video. I didn't go into great detail about it. And there was a guy in the comments who came along and just attacked me and said that was the worst thing in the world. And I said, well, you know, Pickering and Stanton did that for years. I'm sure their engineers knew what they were doing. And it was the worst little flame war that went on in the comments. This guy just really, the guy was nasty. So I ended up deleting the entire thread and just letting it go. So I have been flamed for this many times. And even I myself, over the years, have looked for solid information about this because Shure actually had cartridges with brushes on them as well in the 1980s, and their instructions were a little bit more precise, but not much. And so there was just a lot of questions about this. Just the other day, I was looking once again for information about proper setup with a brush because right now I am running a Stanton 680EL with a 6800 EL stylus that I have added a brush to. I bought a couple of cheap aftermarket styli that came with the brushes, and I put it on that stylus. And by the way, it works perfectly. The aftermarket styli were a bust as far as using them on the cartridge, but we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. And I came across a thread on the Audio Karma site that was posted by a man who claims to have been the president of Stanton until the company was sold in 2006. And his name on the site here, his handle is E. Maydell. And I went online, I tried to find more information about Mr. Maydell, but I just couldn't. So if anybody knows more, feel free to tell me where to find it in the comments. I will also attempt to find this thread once again, and I will give you a link to it in the description so you can read it yourself. And of course, there were many, many, many replies, and a lot of very interesting things came out about Stanton. I'd like to read this to you for anybody who's watching on a small resolution device and doesn't want to squint at their screen. I know some people say, I don't like to be read to, but other people's like it. So we're going to do what them people's like, because I like to be read to. I don't want to have to squint at a little screen. Well, Mr. Maydell writes, as I have stated previously, I was Pickering's sales manager in the late 70s and the vice president of sales and Pickering, and marketing rather, for Stanton during the 90s, up until the company was sold. As such, I have a lot of insider knowledge of just what made either a Pickering or Stanton cartridge work, and have to say that I'm pleased by the photos I've seen on this site of various Stanton carts owned by members who use the dust brush when playing records. The Dust-O-Matic brush, as Pickering called it, or the long hair brush, as Stanton called it, were ridiculed and derided by most of the industry for decades, as was customary. Audio salesmen never read instructions, so the need for adding an additional gram of weight to the tone arm's setting was often ignored, and as such, using the cartridges with the brushes attached would indeed result in mistracking. Upon joining Pickering, I asked the company's engineers just whether or not the brush was useful or detrimental. I suggested that due to the level of ridicule directed at the company by all of the competition, we needed to either explain the benefits of the brush or get rid of it altogether if it were indeed such a terrible thing. A booklet called The Do's and Don'ts of the Dust-O-Matic brush was published, and it explained very well just what the brush did and didn't do. Most importantly, provided the user increased both the tracking force and anti-skating force settings by 1 gram to compensate for the weight of the brush, it didn't interfere in tracking whatsoever. The brush also worked very effectively at damping out low-frequency resonance, and best of all, at least to me, was that it dampened the tone arm itself to allow it to play warped records. So it's nice to see that current owners of either Pickering or Stanton carts who post photos of their carts on Audio Karma do so with the brush in place. So, apparently the brush does more than just clean dust off your records. It helps to smooth out the low frequency response. I can tell you with my personal listening tests with my Stanton 680 cartridge this time around that yes, it does do that, and it does help with warped records to stabilize the head end of the tone arm there so it doesn't bounce out of a groove. And another benefit, of course, is the fact that it simply brushes dust out of the way of the stylus as it tracks. Now, it's not designed to clean a dirty record. That's not what that little brush is supposed to do. What the brush does is just catch any kind of hair or dust that gets on the record, so you don't have to use your record brush or clean it as often. And it certainly is a nice little extra feature. I have always liked the little Stanton brush and the little Pickering brushes. And unlike Shure cartridges that had those brushes, you can't hear a little preview of what's on the record through headphones. Shure cartridges had brushes as well. To the left here, we have their last hi-fi cartridge, which was the M97XE, which, by the way, now go for an unbelievable amount of money on eBay, new old stock. They sold for $79 new, and now they're anywhere between $200 and $400 on eBay, still in the box. And the one on the right there is an RX-T5, which Shure made for Radio Shack in the mid-'80s. That was what was called a universal cartridge. It could work on a P-mount turntable, or it could work on a turntable half-inch with an adapter. I'm tempted to buy one of those and play with it, but I don't think I'm going to do that. The Shure cartridges with the brushes would track nicely, but there were some problems with the Shure brushes. First of all, the bristles were very tightly packed together, and they would pick up dirt from the record, and it would be like impacted in there. With the Stanton and Pickering brushes, they were super easy to clean. Just use the tip of your finger or your stylus brush, and you could clean off the thing there. These were a little bit more difficult to clean. Plus, there was that little preview of the sound. So most of the time, when I did have Shure cartridges that had the brush, I just put it up. And in the manuals, Shure stated that the brush degraded their audio quality. And if you didn't need it, like to play a warped record, you should turn it off. Whereas with Stanton, as I have said, even with headphones, I don't hear any difference in the sound with or without the brush, as far as the brush making any noises or anything like that. So as long as the stylus assembly is working the way it should and the brush pivots freely, you shouldn't have a problem with that. One quick thing before I wrap up this video, when I post about Stanton and Pickering cartridges, as I have done through the years, one of the questions that I am constantly asked is, where do I get replacement styli for these cartridges, and what's good and what isn't? I can't answer that question, unfortunately. I have dumped a lot of money into buying aftermarket styli for Stanton and Pickering cartridges, and I have been disappointed every single time thus far. Now, it is true, I have not bought a Jaico, and those are terribly expensive. They are still available today. They cost a lot of money, and they're hard to find, and I think you have to buy them in Japan, and there's an import cost, and the shipping is very high. I think your best bet, instead of buying the cheap aftermarket styli, and I have been disappointed by all of them, styli from Turntable Needles, styli from LP Gear, styli from Fan Steel, they have all disappointed. The problem that I have with my cartridges, and I have a Stanton 500 and a Stanton 680 right now, the styli themselves don't seem to be all that bad, but the stylus is not working with the cartridge electrically. The magnets all seem to be way too powerful. They have too much flux, and so what they end up doing is overloading the coils in the cartridge and creating a lot of distortion. This doesn't have anything to do with the tracking of the stylus. It has to do with the fact that it's just overloading the coils and saturating them, and you get a lot of very nasty distortion. And of course, there's nothing that you can do about that at all. I have found that the only thing that really seems to work are new old stock Stanton and Pickering styli. And the way you get those is to get on eBay and look for them. They pop up every now and again. People know how much they're worth, and they sell them for a lot of money. There is one stylus that's available that I have not tried, but I'm a little afraid to try. It's on LP Gear, and it is a direct replacement for the Stanton 681. They sell it for about $97, and they claim that it is something that is made themselves and that it's made in Japan, and I'm wondering if that one would work, but that is a lot of money to put out there just to see if a stylus is going to work on one of these old cartridges. And if it doesn't work, then I would feel kind of strange about sending it back. I've had some mixed experiences with LP Gear in the past. Sometimes they can be very responsive and easy to work with, and other times, if you are needing help with something, they can ignore you. So I'm not quite sure where to go with that. My personal strategy, as far as playing around with my Stanton 680, which I'm enjoying listening to quite a bit, and I'm using it to play back 45s. I have a huge collection of 45s, and right now on my Fluence turntable, I am running an Audio-Technica VM540 ML, which has that microline stylus on it, and it is not appropriate for playing old mono LPs or any type of 45 because the polystyrene 45s, they're very fragile, and the wrong kind of stylus, if it's not aligned exactly perfectly, we're talking about any sort of microline stylus or vivid line or hyperelliptical. They're very, very hard on styrene 45s. They can cut a new groove. Somebody said, well, that doesn't make sense. I mean, don't they have the biggest contact area? And they have, yes, that's all true, but they're also very sharp. and it's a different shape. And polystyrene is not vinyl, and it reacts in bad ways to certain styli. I found out the hard way that you really shouldn't be playing vinyl, or rather polystyrene 45s with the Ortophone 2M Blue. Ortophon. Still doing it, sorry. And that was because I noticed that it was causing some damage. Fortunately, I caught it before it did anything drastic or messed up a whole bunch of records. But yeah, I don't recommend that one for polystyrene 45s. You really need to have a conical or a mild elliptical to play back polystyrene. I should actually look for a D6800A stylus, but I haven't been able to find one of those. That is the conical stylus for the Stanton 680 body. That's probably the one that I should run. So my strategy is just to keep checking in on eBay and seeing if I can find, some new old stock stuff that pops up. And even that can be a bit of a risk, because if it's really, really old stock, going back to the 70s or 80s for these cartridges, chances are the rubber parts, the suspensions in them, are all dried up and they won't track properly. It's just part of the fun of playing with these really old cartridges. But as I stated earlier, I don't think, well, actually, maybe not in this take, but in an earlier take which you didn't see, one of the things I pointed out is that they really don't make cartridges like this anymore. And of course, the choices are getting narrower and narrower. We've lost Stanton, they're out of business, or if they are in business, they're not doing much these days. They were bought up by Gibson Musical Instruments, and they kind of ran them into the ground and sold off all the stock, and now there's not much left. I don't even know if Stanton is in business anymore. Pickering's been long out of business, and Shure, of course, closed down at a time when it didn't make sense to close down, because records are doing better than they have done in years and years, and it would seem to me that there could be a spot in the world of Shure for some very fine phono cartridges from them. So if anybody from Shure is listening, we miss you and we'd like you to come back. You don't have to put brushes on your cartridges, though. Just please. All right, gang, I'm done. I've rambled on enough. I do not know when I will post another video about audio, because I have sworn myself off of buying any audio equipment at least until the first of the year, because I have spent an insane amount of money on phono cartridges, and not enough people watch these videos to compensate for the money I've spent. So share this with friends, man. Maybe this will be the one, huh? Who knows? Until we do it again, talk to you later.